He had it all: wealth, influence, triumph. But in one fleeting moment, Michael Carter's life came to a halt. Through the tinted glass of his high-end vehicle, he spotted her, Olivia Grant, the only woman who ever truly captured his heart, standing on a chilly sidewalk, holding a baby, asking for spare change. Her eyes, once brimming with aspirations, were now shadowed with sorrow. How did things come to this? Michael could drive off, pretending he never saw her. Or he could step out, confront the past, and risk everything to alter her future. What he did next was astonishing. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Real Life Chronicles. Please hit subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It means a lot to us. Also, share this video with your friends and family, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss our future videos. Thank you for your support. Sit back and relax as we delve into the story. The city pulsed like a living creature, its veins clogged with honking cabs, hurried footsteps, and a distant buzz of ambition. Park Avenue was no stranger to power. Men in sharp suits strode with purpose, their polished shoes striking the pavement in a rhythm dictated by wealth. It was here, amidst the towering skyscrapers, that Michael Carter sat in his black Mercedes, stuck at a red light, unaware of the moment that would change everything. He loosened his silk tie, the warmth from the car's vents brushing his face as he exhaled. The day had been grueling. Back-to-back meetings, strategy calls, numbers on a screen that dictated the movements of an empire he had built from scratch. But in that moment, none of it mattered, because his gaze had just fallen upon someone that shouldn't exist in this world of power and privilege. At first, it was just a casual glance through the window, the kind made out of boredom, while waiting for the city to grant permission to move. But what he saw made his breath catch. A woman, wrapped in a tattered coat, her arms cradling a baby. The biting wind tugged at the loose strands of her dark hair, partially covering her face as she extended a trembling hand toward the passing crowd. A paper cup, a silent plea, a life unraveling before his very eyes. Something about her tugged at him, an ache so unfamiliar that he barely recognized it. And then, as if time itself had rewound 20 years, she turned. Their eyes met. Michael felt the impact like a punch to his chest. Olivia. The name echoed to the corridors of his mind, stirring memories long buried beneath layers of success and survival. Olivia Grant. The girl who once owned his heart. The girl who whispered dreams beneath Brooklyn streetlights. The girl whose laughter had been the soundtrack of his youth. And now here she was, a ghost from his past, begging on the streets of Manhattan. The light turned green. The city demanded motion, but Michael couldn't move. The past has a strange way of creeping in, slipping through the cracks of time when you least expect it. Michael Carter had spent years outrunning it, burying old wounds beneath skyscrapers, multi-million-dollar deals, and the illusion of control. But in the span of a single heartbeat, everything he had built trembled beneath the weight of a memory. Olivia Grant. The name curled around his thoughts like smoke, thick and suffocating. He could still hear her voice if he let himself, soft, teasing, filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He could still picture her as she was back then, 17, fierce and full of fire, the only girl who had ever made her believe in something more than survival. They had grown up in a world that demanded toughness, in a neighborhood where dreams were whispered cautiously, as if saying them too loudly might shatter them. But Olivia, she never whispered. She spoke of the future like it was something she could hold in her hands, something she could mold into whatever shape she wanted. Michael, one day we're going to leave this place. Yeah, you'll be some genius businessman, and I don't know, maybe I'll travel, maybe I'll paint. Something big, something real. She had been so certain. And for a time, he believed in her certainty more than he believed in himself. But certainty wasn't enough. Reality had a way of tearing through promises like paper. The scholarships, the acceptance letter to Harvard, his escape route appeared, and he took it. They had promised to make it work. But distance became an unspoken wedge. Time turned their connection into late-night calls that grew shorter, then stopped altogether. He had always told himself it was inevitable that life had pulled them apart, that success demanded sacrifice. So why? After all these years, did seeing her now feel like a mistake he had never stopped making? The woman on the street wasn't the Olivia he remembered. She was a faded version, a silhouette of someone who once burned too brightly to be ignored. And yet, despite the exhaustion in her eyes, despite the weight that pressed on her shoulders, she was still Olivia, still the girl who had owned his heart. And now she was here, and she was suffering. Michael gripped the leather armrest of his seat, his heartbeat loud in his ears. What had happened to her? What had life done to her? And perhaps the more terrifying question, why did he still care this much? The world outside his car moved forward. Pedestrians weaving through the crosswalk. Cabs jolting into motion, the ever-present symphony of Manhattan's relentless pace. But inside the black Mercedes, time stood still. Michael Carter couldn't move. His driver glanced at him through the rear-view mirror. "We're clear to go, sir." Michael didn't respond. His fingers hovered near the door handle, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Every logical instinct screamed at him to let it go. Keep driving. Forget what he saw. Move forward. That's what he did best, wasn't it? For years, Michael had made a career out of cutting away excess, discarding anything that slowed him down. Sentimentality, distractions, regrets. It was the only way to survive in his world. Business didn't care about feelings. Feelings were a liability. And yet, here he was, frozen in place, unable to take his eyes off the woman on the sidewalk. Olivia. She hadn't noticed him yet. The baby in her arms stirred, a soft whimper lost in the noise of the city. The way she clutched the child, the way her shoulders curled inward as if shielding them both from an unseen threat. It did something to him. He had spent years believing their story was over, that life had made its choices for them. But if that were true, then why did it feel like it was caving in? His thoughts collided in rapid succession, a boardroom of competing voices fighting for dominance in his mind. What are you doing? This isn't your problem. She doesn't need you. She's just another person down on their luck. It happens every day. You don't owe her anything. But then there was the other voice, the one that had stayed buried for 20 years. Yes, you do. The light turned green, a horn blared behind them. His driver shifted impatiently. "Sir?" Michael inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening into a fist. This was a mistake. Getting involved would complicate things. He had spent too long keeping his life in perfect order. And Olivia was chaos. And yet, something about the way she stood there, so small against the towering city, so lost in a world that only looked out for themselves. He couldn't ignore it. A decision had to be made. Keep driving or step out. Keep the past buried or face it head on. Michael's pulse roared in his ears as he reached for the door handle. And then he stepped out. The cold hit him first. Sharp, biting, a cruel contrast to the heated whirlwind in his chest. The city pulsed around him, indifferent to the moment unraveling before his eyes. Michael Carter wasn't used to feeling small. He commanded boardrooms, controlled billion-dollar deals with a single decision. But standing there on the sidewalk, just a few feet away from Olivia Grant, he felt unsteady. She hadn't seen him yet. Her head was down, shielding the baby from the wind, her thin coat barely enough to block the cold. Every few seconds, she lifted her gaze, not looking for him, just looking for hope, and it shattered something inside him. Michael took a breath, steadying himself. Then he spoke, Olivia. At first, it didn't register. Her shoulders barely flinched. His voice had been lost in the noise of passing cars, footsteps, the distant chatter of strangers. Then she turned, and in that instant, Michael was 17 again, the same face that had once been his entire universe. Except now it was different. There was no spark, no fire, just weariness, just survival. The girl who once dared to dream had been replaced by a woman who had learned the cost of believing in something better. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Recognition flickered, then confusion, then something else. Disbelief. Michael swallowed. He expected anger. He expected resentment. But he hadn't expected shame. She looked away, her grip tightening around a child in her arms. And just like that, the space between them became heavier than the years that had passed. He took a step closer. Olivia, it's me. She let out a soft, breathy laugh, one that held no humor. I know who you are, Michael. A beat of silence. She didn't say his name with warmth. No nostalgia. No sentiment. Just a quiet, tired acceptance of something that no longer mattered. Michael felt something sharp twist inside him. Was this what time had done to them? He looked at the baby in her arms, wrapped in a thin, patched blanket, small fingers barely visible. His stomach clenched. How long have you been out here? His voice was quieter than he meant it to be. Olivia shifted, her arms tightening protectively around the child. She let out a slow breath, her posture bracing for whatever came next. And then she said the three words that sent a cold blade straight through him. Too damn long. The wind whipped down Park Avenue, sending icy tendrils through the towering buildings, curling around Michael's expensive coat like unseen fingers. But he barely felt it. His entire focus was on the woman in front of him, the woman he had once known better than anyone, now standing before him like a ghost of the past. Olivia Grant. She stood stiffly, her body curled around a baby in her arms, as if shielding the child from something far worse than the cold. Her expression was unreadable, something between exhaustion and quiet defiance. The silence between them stretched thick and unyielding before she finally exhaled a sound barely audible above the city noise. You shouldn't be here, she said. Her voice was different. The warmth he remembered was buried beneath layers of something heavier. Michael's chest tightened. Neither should you. A flicker of something crossed her face. Anger? Hurt? He couldn't tell. She turned her head slightly, as if debating whether to walk away. Instead, she let out a humorless laugh. Still blunt, huh? He almost smiled. Almost. But there was nothing amusing about this. Olivia, he started, his voice softer now. What happened? For a moment, it looked like she might answer. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes flickering with something unguarded. Then, just as quickly, the walls went up. She shook her head. It doesn't matter. It does to me, she scoffed, shifting the baby slightly in her arms. The tiny child stirred, making a soft, whimpering sound that sent a fresh wave of urgency through Michael's chest. Olivia saw the way his gaze dropped to the baby. Her grip tightened instinctively. Protective. Wary. A mother who had been forced to fight. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice quieter now, edged with something he couldn't quite name. Do what? Pretend you care. The words hit harder than they should have. Pretend. Did she really think he was capable of that? Michael exhaled sharply. I'm not pretending. Olivia. He met her gaze, unwavering. Talk to me, please. She hesitated. He could see the battle happening behind her eyes. A fight between trust and survival. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed, looking away. I thought I had everything figured out, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I really did. Michael stayed silent, giving her space to continue. I was doing okay, she went on. Not rich, not powerful, but okay. I had a job, a life. I wasn't struggling like this. Her eyes flickered downward, her fingers tightening around the baby's blanket. Then she swallowed, shaking her head. Things went bad. Fussed. Michael clenched his jaw. What kind of bad could reduce someone like Olivia to this? She took a shaky breath. I trusted the wrong person. A cold, sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Olivia. She forced a bitter smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I won't bore you with the details. You don't need to hear all that. I do. His voice was firm, but not unkind. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for something. And for the first time in their conversation, her voice cracked. I lost everything, Michael. Something sharp twisted inside his chest. She shook her head quickly, as if she didn't want pity. I try to fight back, I swear. But when you have nothing, when the world turns its back on you, there's only so much you can do. She gave a dry laugh. Turns out, people only care when you have something to offer. Michael's stomach clenched at her words. I had no money, no home, no one to turn to. She looked down at the baby in her arms. And then there was him. Michael's mind raced with silent questions. Who was the father? Where was he? Why wasn't he here helping her? Olivia, he said carefully. Who? Don't ask. Her voice was sharp, immediate, a wound not ready to be touched. He hesitated, then nodded. Not now, but soon. Instead, he did the only thing that felt right. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. Without hesitation, he grabbed a thick stack of cash, more than enough to get her off the streets, at least for a little while. Olivia's eyes darted to the money, then back to his face, and then she laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh he remembered from their past. This one was cold, bitter. What? He asked, taken aback. You think that fixes this? She asked, shaking her head. God, Michael, you really haven't changed. His jaw tightened. I'm trying to help. No, you're trying to throw money at the problem and hope it goes away. She shot back. That's what rich people do, right? The word stung, but not because they were unfair, because they were true. Michael exhaled slowly, lowering the money. Fine, he said. Then tell me what you need. Olivia stared at him for a long moment. Then finally she whispered, I need a way out. Michael Carter had made a name for himself by solving impossible problems. He built his tech empire from the ground up, made deals that seemed untouchable, and pulled himself out of Brooklyn with nothing but ambition and sheer willpower. But standing here, face to face with Olivia Grant, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Helpless. Her words, I need a way out, echoed in his mind, refusing to settle. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way she said them. She wasn't just asking for help. She was asking for a lifeline. Michael inhaled deeply, then exhaled, steadying himself against the weight of the moment. Come with me, he said finally, his voice firm. Olivia's lips parted slightly in surprise, but just as quickly, her expression hardened. Michael, no, he frowned. Why not? She shifted the baby slightly in her arms, tucking the blanket closer around his tiny face. Because that's not how this works, she said. You don't just pick someone up off the street and fix their life overnight. Michael arched a brow. You just told me you needed a way out. Her jaw clenched. Yeah, but not like this. Olivia, he sighed, rubbing his temple. Look around you. You're standing out here in the freezing cold, begging strangers for loose change. How much worse does it have to get before you let someone help you? She flinched just slightly. But Michael saw it. She was rejecting help. She was rejecting him. Not because she hated him, but because she didn't trust that it was real. How many times had life let her down? How many promises had been broken before they even had the chance to be kept? Olivia, he said again, softer this time, I'm not offering you charity. She let out a dry laugh. Really? Because it sure feels like it. He shook his head. Charity is impersonal. This isn't. This is me trying to do right by you. She looked away, her fingers curling protectively around the baby's tiny form. Why now, Michael? Her voice was quieter now, almost fragile. After all these years, why do you care? The answer was on the tip of his tongue. But saying out loud felt dangerous. Because I never stopped. Because I owe you more than I can ever repay. Because I see you now and it's killing me. Instead, he said, because I can. She scoffed, shaking her head. You think money is the answer to everything, don't you? Michael exhaled sharply. No, but I do think it could be a damn good start. Olivia looked down at the baby, something unreadable passing across her face. For the first time, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes for what it truly was. It wasn't just tiredness. It was fear. She wasn't just protecting her child. She was protecting herself from hope, from even for a second, believing that someone might actually stay. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Look, he said, carefully choosing his words. You don't have to trust me. You don't have to believe I have the best intentions. But I'm giving you an option. A real one. A warm place to sleep. A chance to figure things out without having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. Olivia hesitated. Michael saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the way her fingers twitched slightly against the baby's blanket. Then just as quickly, her expression hardened again. And then what? She asked. I stay with you for a few nights. And then what? You get bored playing hero. You walk away when it gets too complicated. Michael's jaw tightened. That's not who I am. She let out another humorless laugh. You sure? Because last I checked, that's what happened before. His breath caught in his throat. She wasn't wrong. He had left. Not in a cruel way. Not with intention. But he had left nonetheless. He had walked away from their promises. From their late-night conversations about a future they thought they'd build together. He had let life carry him forward while she had been left behind to fend for herself. Now here she was, standing before him. Proof that the past never truly lets go. Michael swallowed hard. You're right, he admitted. I left before, and I can't change that. Olivia's expression faltered slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to agree. But I can change what happens now, he continued. I can be here, right now. If you let me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael could see it, the war in her mind. A lifetime of disappointment battling against a fragile hope she didn't want to acknowledge. Then slowly, she exhaled. I don't want your pity, Michael. It's not pity, he said. It's a second chance. Another long pause. Then finally, she nodded. It was small, barely there, but it was enough. Michael didn't say anything. He just reached for his phone and dialed his driver. Pick us up, he said, his eyes never leaving Olivia's. And for the first time that night, she didn't look away. The air inside the penthouse was warm, almost too warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold they had left behind. The moment Michael stepped through the door, he saw Olivia hesitate, her fingers tightening around the baby as she took in surroundings. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Furniture that probably cost more than she had seen in years. She didn't say anything, but he could see it in her eyes. The unease, the sharp contrast between where she'd been and where she was now. You can sit down, Michael said, trying to keep his voice casual. He slipped off his coat and tossed it onto a nearby chair. I'll have someone bring you some food. Maybe some... I'm not your guest, Michael. Her voice stopped him in his tracks. He turned to look at her. She was standing just inside the doorway, still holding the baby close, her shoulders tense as if she were ready to bolt at any moment. I'm not here to play house, she continued. I just needed a place to think. Michael exhaled slowly. And that's exactly what this is. She studied him for a moment, searching his face for something. Doubt flickered in her eyes, but there was exhaustion too, a bone-deep kind of weariness that didn't just come from a lack of sleep, but from life itself. Michael stepped closer, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. Olivia, he said softly, when was the last time you slept in a real bed? Her lips pressed into a thin line. When was the last time you ate a full meal or felt safe? A flicker of something passed across her face. Anger, maybe, or something more fragile. She looked away, adjusting the baby in her arms. Michael didn't push. He simply turned and walked toward the kitchen. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, then set it on the counter along with a plate of fruit and some bread from the pantry. Nothing fancy, nothing overwhelming, just something. You don't have to talk, he said, leaning against the counter. You don't have to explain anything, but you do have to eat. Olivia stood frozen for a moment. Then slowly, she walked forward. She didn't sit, didn't relax, but she reached for the water bottle, twisting the cap off with one hand and taking a small sip. Michael watched as she eyed the food. She hesitated, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to take it. Then, after a long pause, she picked up a slice of bread and tore off a small piece, bringing it to her mouth. The silence stretched between them. Then finally she spoke. I got fired. Michael straightened slightly. My boss was... She shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. Let's just say he liked to take what wasn't his. And when I didn't let him, suddenly my hours got cut. Then my paycheck disappeared. Then my job. Michael's jaw clenched. She exhaled. I tried to fight it. I tried everything. But it was like... She paused, searching for the right words. It was like trying to scream underwater. No one listened. No one cared. Michael's fingers curled into fists at his sides. Of course, no one cared. That was the way the world worked. People like him, CEOs, the elite, they got to set the rules. People like her? They were expected to survive them. And the father? He asked, his voice controlled, but barely. Olivia let out a short, humorless laugh. Gone. The moment he found out I was pregnant. She shook her head. Not that he was much of a loss. Michael's blood boiled. He didn't know who this man was, but he hated him. Hated him for leaving her, for letting her suffer, for putting that look in her eyes. Olivia, Michael said slowly, carefully, "Who is your boss?" She looked at him then, suspicion flashing across her face. "Why?" Michael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't planned on getting involved. He hadn't planned on doing more than giving her a place to rest. But now he was furious. "Because people like that don't get to win," he said. Her eyes narrowed. "And what? You think you can stop him?" Michael met her gaze. "I know I can." Silence. Then Olivia shook her head, laughing bitterly. "God, you really don't get it, do you?" "Get what?" She set the baby down gently on the couch, wrapping him securely in the blanket. Then she turned to face Michael fully. "This isn't your world anymore, Michael. You left this life behind a long time ago. You live up here now." She gestured vaguely around the penthouse, high above everything, untouchable. But down there, her voice dropped lower. "Down there, people like me get chewed up and spit out every day. And no one does a damn thing about it." Michael's chest tightened. He hated that she believed that. But the worst part? She wasn't wrong. He had spent years focusing on himself, on building his empire, on making sure he never had to struggle again. And in doing so, he had stopped looking back. But now he was looking. And he didn't like what he saw. Michael stepped forward. "You think I don't remember what it was like?" he asked, his voice quiet and tense. "You think I forgot where I came from?" Olivia folded her arms. "Didn't you?" Michael didn't look away. "No." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter, Michael. You can't fix this." He held her gaze. "Maybe not," he shrugged, "but I can sure as hell try." She stared at him, searching his face for something. Then finally, her expression softened just slightly. Michael didn't say anything else. He just pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and hit dial. "James," he said when the call connected, "I need you to look into someone for me." Olivia didn't stop him. And for the first time in a long time, Michael Carter felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The city stretched out beyond the penthouse windows, its lights flickering like stars trapped between glass and concrete. From this high up, Manhattan looked almost peaceful, silent, untouchable. But Michael Carter knew better. The world below was anything but quiet. It was ruthless, chaotic, and unforgiving. It swallowed people whole. It had almost swallowed Olivia. And now, he wasn't sure how to let her go. She stood by the window, her arms folded, staring out into the city. The baby, her baby, slept peacefully on the couch, wrapped in a blanket far too thin for the winter she had been surviving. Michael had spent the last 24 hours making calls, finding out names, exposing corruption, making sure the man who had ruined her life would never get the chance to do it to someone else. But now, with the battle fought, he was left with something far more dangerous. The question of what came next. Olivia turned, her dark eyes unreadable. "So what happens now, Michael?" The way she said his name, it was different now. Not cold, not hostile, just cautious. Michael leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That depends. What do you want to happen?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Turn things back on me." She shook her head. "You always made me answer my own questions." Michael smirked. "That's because you always had the answers." Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. Not anymore. The honesty in her voice hit him harder than he expected. For years, she had been the girl who always had a plan, who always knew what she wanted, even when life tried to take it from her. But now, she was standing on the edge of something new, something uncertain. And for the first time, Michael realized just how much she had lost. His voice softened. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight. Olivia." She exhaled, shaking her head. "You don't get it. I don't have time. I have a baby, Michael. I have to figure things out for him." She looked over at the sleeping child, her expression unreadable. I don't get to make mistakes. Michael studied her. The way her fingers clenched, the way her breathing quickened just slightly, the weight of it all pressing down on her. He understood responsibility. He understood pressure. But he didn't understand what it was like to carry it alone. And that was something he wasn't willing to let her do. Olivia, he said carefully, what if you didn't have to do it alone? She froze, just for a second. Then her shoulders squared. Michael, don't. I mean it, he cut in. You and the baby, you don't have to leave. Stay, as long as you need, until you find a job, until you figure things out. No conditions, no expectations. Just stay. Olivia stared at him. And what? I just move into your penthouse and live happily ever after? Michael smiled. I'm not asking you to marry me, Olivia. She smirked just barely. Good, because that would be a hell of a proposal. He chuckled. The tension between them softened just a little. But then she took a step closer. Her expression turned serious again. Michael, she said quietly, why are you really doing this? He didn't answer right away. How could he put into words everything that had been building inside him since the moment he saw her on that sidewalk? The guilt, the regret, the undeniable, inescapable fact that he had never stopped caring. But instead of saying all that, he did something he hadn't done in years. He told her the truth. Because it's you, he said simply. And it's always been you. Olivia inhaled sharply. Just a breath. Just a second. But Michael saw it. He saw the way her fingers twitched at her sides. The way her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something but didn't trust herself to. She took another breath. Then finally, she looked him in the eyes. And for the first time in a long, long time, Michael Carter saw hope. We've come to the end of this story. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to turn on your notifications for my next video.